Welcome, everyone. My name is Ashley Smithers, and I'm joined by our presenter, Shell Devlaeminck. Oh, I'm sorry, Shell, from Swamp. She is going to give us a fun presentation on sites throughout the county that Swamp has surveyed for amphibians. After the webinar, please be sure to fill out our survey. This just gives us feedback on what you liked, what you didn't like, and how we can improve things in the future. Before I turn it over to Shell, I wanted to let you know a little bit about Clark Conservation District. Could you switch to the next slide, Shell? And some of the exciting things that we have coming up. Clark Conservation District is a non-regulatory agency that works with the residents of Clark County, providing technical assistance to encourage good stewardship of our environment. We put on a number of workshops and webinars like this one. To check out some of our past webinars, head over to our website, clarkcd.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter to learn about any upcoming webinars we have. Next month, we are going to have a really awesome presentation about stormwater impacts on amphibians, which will be on April 22nd. So that's a little bit about me and Clark Conservation District. Let's see who's joining us tonight. So let me check out that poll. So hopefully you guys can all see that. It looks like we have a student, and a lot of you guys are members of the public, with a few people that are work for a private company and consultant. But I'm happy to see that 60% of you love amphibians, and hopefully by the end of the evening, we will have that to be 100%. So with that, I'm going to switch it over to Shell.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. So my name is Shell Devlaeminck, and these are a number of amphibians that I have found throughout Clark County in their various stages throughout various points in the last several years. So you can kind of see got this large rough-skinned newt at the bottom, and different frogs and salamanders in their different stages. So the reason I know so much about amphibians is because I am currently the project leader for the Southwest Washington Amphibian Monitoring Project, which is also known as SWAMP. So kind of how we identify ourselves is as an all-volunteer program dedicating to empowering community members to assess and preserve unique ecological resources for our community. And it is actually a project for the Northwest Ecological Research Institute, also known as NERI, which I'm a board member for, and so is Ashley. So great working with them. They're an awesome partner as well. And then if you'd like to get involved or learn more about SWAMP, you can always email me at swampproject2008, which is when we started, at gmail.com. So what we're mostly looking for is pond breeding amphibians, really. So the two target species that we look for are the northern red-legged frog and the northwest salamander, because we're out counting egg masses, because the eggs are a lot easier to find than the actual amphibians. You know, they stay still for a while, and they're in predictable places. So each of these females can only lay one egg mass. So we can actually get a count of how many breeding females are in the area by counting their egg masses. And they also tend to use the larger ponds, you know, that often don't dry up mid-year, so it makes them compete with the bullfrogs like a little bit more. And then these are the other native species that we track, the northern Pacific tree frog and the long-toed salamander. But with these, each female lays several egg masses, so it's not as indicative of how many females are there by the exact number of egg masses. So we just kind of get like a general count, you know, to kind of like assess their presence. But they're actually adapted to use a lot of the smaller ponds. They have a cool adaptation where they can actually sense when the ponds are drying up and then get out of there faster, metamorphose, so that they can use it before it dries up. And then these are some amphibians that we don't really find around here anymore, which is kind of why we've been monitoring to kind of see what's been going on with the amphibians that we have in our area. So if you ever want to go out and do any searching for amphibians yourself, you want to make sure that you disinfect all of your equipment. And the reason for that is these fungal pathogens and diseases. I have some pictures here of these like white eggs. You can kind of see in some of these spots where the fungus has taken over those particular eggs and killed them. So sometimes it'll just infect like one egg in a mass. Sometimes it'll get a bunch of them, you know, but it travels on organic material. So if you've traveled in any watery sites, you know, you've got the potential to carry it to new sites. So, you know, just if you do any amphibian hunting on your own, make sure that you clean all of your gear, preferably with one of these two, Quat 128, which admittedly is really hard to get. And if you don't know about it, then, you know, you probably won't be able to get it because it's a waxy brand. But it's a really good natural alternative to bleach because it breaks down in the environment a lot better than bleach. But you have to like have an account and order a bunch at one time. So it's impractical for most people, but bleach, you know, you can get some at the dollar store. The only thing is, in order to be safe for amphibians, you know, it has to be fresh. So like within the last like 30 days, and then you just water it down like 1/100th, you know, or like 1 to 100, the bleach solution to the water, you know, and either soak your equipment in it or spray it down, you know, wait 10 minutes and then rinse it off really well. So make sure you're just not passing any diseases onto any of our ponds. So getting into the good stuff, where to find amphibians in Clark County. They're really all over the place. This is one pond that's like by an apartment complex. We found some chorus frogs there. This is a Heritage Farm, is up on like 78th Street. There used to be like the WSU extension there. They were doing like some research plots, and now the master gardeners and master composters and some community gardeners use it. Back in the corner, there's this really cool cherry orchard. That's like a natural cherry orchard. And there's this cool natural pond that's back there that we discovered. So I did a lot of research in like the summer of like 2017 about a lot of these sites as well. So I have some comparative pictures of kind of some of these sites, how they've changed through time. So over on the left here, we have the pictures of how they were, you know, back in the summer of 2017. You know, you can see it dries up a lot more at that point, you know, and is a lot more green. And then in the spring, it's a lot more wet. But it's kind of been, you know, there is a lot more water like further into the trees, but I've kind of noticed that amphibians like to have some sunshine and some, you know, openness where they lay their eggs. So a lot of these spots get really overgrown by trees. The amphibians don't use them as much. So we found the majority of the egg masses actually in this area that was like really open and sunny over here. So you can kind of see some of what we found. There were like a lot of chorus frog egg masses back there. So you can see the various types of chorus frogs. And we actually found some chorus frog adults themselves. You can see a little close up of this guy that we saw in the brush. He almost blended in. A volunteer I was working with pointed about to me, and it took me a second to see him because of his calling. And she was like, yeah, I wouldn't have seen him if he hadn't hopped. So, they blend in really well. And unless you're, right where they're at and very attentive, it's easy to miss them. And then there's also this ditch that's over close to the entrance. There's even this little fence or bridge that you walk across. So again, over on the left is those earlier summer photographs. So I don't know, this ditch has kind of changed a lot over time. Like when I first started surveying it, this area here by the bridge was a lot more open, and there were red-legged frogs that were using it. And then over time it grew in a lot, as you can see, and it's just not as good of habitat because I don't know. It's more crowded, not as much sun, not as much water, whatever. But we had a lot of long-toed salamanders that were using it. And then recently, when I came back, they just cut down all of the grass that was along there. So it actually seemed to be an effective measure because we've got tons of long-toed salamanders. They're kind of hard to see, but these little, bubbles in here are just, it's full of little egg masses. So we actually found over 100 long-toed salamander egg masses in that ditch. That was just in like a short portion of it. So there's obviously, at least like 300 or 400 in there. So that was pretty cool. There's also ponds on private property. This is one that I was surveying with a volunteer. It's kind of like a more like meadowy area that floods during the wet season. So it kind of had this long stretch of water. And then after we had the snow, it kind of filled up the whole rest of the meadow. So we actually didn't find any egg masses in that area because all of that water was new as of like, a few days before we did our survey. But we found a number of Horus frogs and long-toed salamander egg masses. They're the tiniest ones that are the hardest to identify. But I thought it was really interesting because usually we can kind of tell one of the distinguishing characteristics is number of eggs. So for the long-toed salamanders, they have the range of like 1 to 25 eggs, whereas the chorus frogs have the range typically of like 10 to 80 eggs. So they do have that overlap of like, 10 to 25 eggs where you're like, which one is it? And then you have to go by the double jelly. But we were finding a bunch of these really tiny egg masses with chorus frogs, and there's obviously like no double jelly, and there's very few eggs in them. And the pond was also very, very cold. Like both times I visited it, it was very, very cold compared to the other ponds. So I wonder if the temperature affects them in some way in that pond. And then up at WSU, they have a ton of ponds. I actually haven't even been to all of them, and they keep changing. But this is one of the Bookstore Pond. It's right next to their bookstore. I will never go into this pond again because I got really muddy, just covered in gunk the last time that I did. And it gets so deep, it goes over the top of your waders, so it's, a little, rough to survey. But there's a bunch of red-legged frogs in there. Actually, soon after the program started, there was a bullfrog sighting there, and Peter Ritson, who started the Southwest Washington Amphibian Monitoring Project back in the day actually got a permit to remove that bullfrog. But by the time he was able to get out there, or he saw there were multiple bullfrogs, so they'd already kind of infested the pond. So he was kind of like, nothing we can do now. But then we also have this pond kind of across from the basketball court. It kind of starts up higher, like close to like where the bus stop is, and then kind of like meanders along the trail for a long time. And like a lot of the water on campus kind of moves slowly and like filters through all of their areas. They did a really good job of keeping the riparian zone intact in a lot of these spots, having a little riparian corridor next to their flowing water. So it gets a little thick in some places, but you know, we were definitely able to find a couple red-legged frogs, some chorus frogs in there. And then I got a little smattering of some data that we've collected. This South Detention Pond, you know, used to be fairly good for red-legged frogs, but I feel like it's been declining over the years. And it's just been kind of like a little, I don't know, dingy and like shaded. And there's like a lot of leaf litter and stuff that I feel like is kind of affecting, I don't know, the vegetation. So I don't know, we're still finding, you know, like one or two red-legged frogs in there, but, you know, it's not able to, I don't know, hold 8 or whatever like it used to. This, I think, is a really cool pond. I've been calling it the Compost Pond because it's right across from their compost pile that they grounds people have on campus. But it was actually some of the grounds crew facilities or whatever actually made a really big project out of this pond because they raised the spot where the water flows out and were able to expand the area that holds water by a considerable amount. So they were like, oh, look at what the big pond we created on campus. So, you know, of course I wanted to check it out and see how well it was doing for amphibians. So here I have like a little earlier this year, these bottom left 2 photos. And then, you know, after the snow, I've got a little panorama video. It's definitely a little bit deeper. And it's a really large pond that has a lot of red-legged frogs that are already hatching. So even if the water level drops drastically, you know, like within, you know, a short period of time, they'll still be able to find those watery spots. In years past, I did see some water level drops that left a bunch of those red-legged frog egg masses high and dry. So I always kind of want to keep an eye out to see if it's an ecological sink or if it's actually supporting amphibian life, which it seems like for the most part it is supporting their life. And then there's also these like chorus frog egg mass, you know, it's kind of funny. Sometimes they're just really dirty and hard to decipher there. But here, we've also got this East Channel by the barn, which is one that we newly discovered because we've been doing this barn pond for a really long time. And then we kind of were like, oh, there's all this water over here next to us, and ended up serving that and finding a few red-legged frogs in there. You can kind of see that grape-like texture that gives away the red-legged frogs. But yeah, it's got a nice long channel that kind of curves to the side in this kind of farmy area. So I don't know, it's like lots of grassy, large grassy stuff that it's going through. So this is the North Pond. So another one that we added when we noticed it's behind the pond, the barn at WSU, but over the years, the trees have been growing so much by it that it's really shading it out for these red-legged frogs. And this year when I went, I didn't find any at all. So I'm considering taking it off my survey list if it's not actually supporting. But it used to be a good spot for them, and we found forest frogs. And but as you can see, there's just getting to be like a lot of trees shading it in. And even now, you know, there's plenty of water. It's just I don't know, maybe just not enough sunlight for them. But the barn pond is one of our hot spots. It's actually like across the street from the barn, and we find consistently a lot of red-legged frogs and a few northwest salamanders spattered in there, and you know, some of the long toads and Horus. So you know, it supports all of the amphibians around, which is really cool. So in the summer, you know, it's a lot more vegetative. This is in July, and then a little bit later it dries up in August. But as you can see, there's a lot of trees around it. So I don't know, it's interesting because it's like such a large pond that no matter how many trees are by it, you can't really shade it out. So, you know, that seems to kind of be the ticket. But these are some more recent photos that I took. There's just a lot of woody surroundings, so lots of opportunities for them to hide when they leave the pond, which is another thing that I feel like they look for. And here's some northwest salamander with the firm jelly that we found here, as well as some red-legged frogs. So one of my favorite ponds to visit. Then we have Northmoor and Wilding, which is a really cool site that is very large and behind a gate. So this is one of their ponds, and here's, you know, another one. Has some different chorus frogs, red-legged frogs that we found there. I'd like to do more surveys there because I saw a lot of volunteers have in the past. That's something I want to continue. This, I think, is a really cool site, the Heritage Trail. It's actually, now, this last time that I went, it's behind a gated complex. You know, it used to be kind of behind this new, you know, developed area where they were still building houses, you know, for the last few years, but now it's like a gated community. So it used to have like, you know, no vegetation, but still a decent number of amphibians. But this last time when I went, it's totally different. They fenced it up. There's a lot more vegetation growing. So this is a nice, pleasant surprise. So I'll get the gate open this weekend and I'll be able to check out what's inside. And then here we have some data for the Silicone Forest, which used to be able to support red-legged frogs and apparently some northwest salamanders back in the day. But I don't know what's going on. And now these days it only supports the chorus frogs and long-toed salamanders, but it has a lot of them, and it's a nice deep pond. So I don't really know what's going on there. There's a lot of raspberries growing along the edge of it, and it's kind of like a long ditch, like a trench. So it gets pretty deep, like almost up to your chest. But there's lots of chorus frogs all throughout it, and long-toed salamanders. And there's this little rock berm in the middle, and then it goes down into another area of water that's a little smaller on the other side. But then we just have to come back because there's no way to get out at the end. Up at Lucia Falls, these are some natural ponds up there. So just in the rocks by the stream there, basically. So there actually don't have a ton of vegetation in them, but it's really cool to see the amphibians just use like all of the available vegetation that is there sometimes. So I call this one in the middle like the Salamander Pond, because I've found Northwest salamanders there, and it usually takes them, it seems like in this pond, like or more than a year to metamorphose. So I don't know, I found them there at odd times. So then I kind of calculate the rest of the ponds. I'd be like below the Salamander Pond, you know, there's kind of this pond that I never find anything in. And then these ones over here kind of get flooded in the spring. So it's not really ideal spots for amphibians. And this one, I think maybe there's just like not like enough like, I don't know, but vegetation surrounding it, you know, like places for them to go, as well as the shade. So I don't know, I feel like when there's like multiple available sites that they'll choose the one that's best, instead of just going everywhere. But this one above the Salamander Pond, they also use, we've seen several red-legged frogs, and there's this little skinnier one where we see a bunch of chorus frogs as well sometimes. So yeah, there's a bunch of them up there. It's sometimes a little bit hard to climb on the rocks with your waders, but you know, it's a lot of fun to see these natural sites. So here's some this spring, some red-legged frogs that we found, and then that Salamander Pond. Again, yeah, it doesn't have a ton of vegetation, but they use whatever's there. So this is, we have such an original name for it. Salmon Creek Avenue and like Northeast 134th Avenue before the restoration. So in the summer, you know, I was kind of seeing at what point, you know, this pond dried up, and these earlier shots, you know, it's got a little bit of water, but as you can see, it definitely dries up. But I don't know, it's a pretty like shaded and like, I don't know, a little dingy. The water didn't seem like a super high quality or whatever. So I don't know, I was always kind of curious about its like performance. And then like a month later, I saw them doing some construction around it after it dried up. So I was like, oh, you know, well, I wonder how that's going to turn out. And it actually turned out really well. They carved, it's kind of like a circular area. So it's got these like shallow spots along here and in the far end. And it's got this nice deep area in the middle here. So this is a picture from in the middle of that deep area. There's some good, you know, cattails and a little duckweed that made it a little harder to see in there. So you kind of had to use your instrument to push it out of the way and see what was going on. But we found several red-legged frog egg masses in that one. So it's doing well. And here we are seeing, yeah, just kind of one after another in a row. They're just all over the place. So yeah, you kind of notice that bubbling and the grape-like texture. So yeah, it's pretty easy to see, you know, once you acclimate your eyes to it. They're so big, you know, they're hard to miss if they're at the surface. But I don't know, there were some that were like further back that were like, we had to push the duckweed out of the way. This is a VGSA. It's over by the Salmon Creek Park. It's like a kind of smaller pond, but we found all 4 different amphibian species in this pond. I noticed, you know, like it does dry out at some point. So like the bullfrogs aren't using it, but there are several other ponds in the area that the bullfrogs are in. So when I was doing this summer survey, I noticed there were like, I was trying to like catch the different tadpoles that were there. And as I was, you know, returning them to the pond, I had to kind of like chase some of the bullfrogs away so that they weren't eating the tadpoles that I was returning to the pond. So I wasn't just, you know, giving them a free meal. You know? No, I'm gonna eat all my data. But yeah, it seems a lot greener in the summer, and then in the spring, you know, it's a lot more open with wider areas of water. And then, yeah, we were really surprised to find this egg mass like within this green algae stuff. You know, usually it's like really, you know, almost like discount looking in there because it is kind of, you know, reminds you of an egg mass, but, you know, obviously isn't. But then, you know, we found some in there and I was like, oh, wow, there's actually a bunch of chorus frog egg masses and this weird algae stuff. So yeah, definitely need to look through that more. Here, Raspberry Fields Park is a public park that has been doing well with the red-legged frogs, chorus frogs, long-toed salamanders. I've noticed it kind of like varies in its water level over time. And like just some of the site visits that I've had, you know, like you can kind of see, like this is in summer, so it's obviously a lot drier in this one, but you know, you can kind of see in this one, like, I don't know, there's like a sharp drop off, you know, that makes it deeper. And then there's this kind of like shallow area, you know, that sometimes when there's a lot more water will kind of like spill over into the shallow area. So sometimes it's a really good area for like long toads and chorus frogs in that shallow area. And sometimes that shallow area doesn't exist. But it's a kind of woody pond with a lot of cattails as well. But I don't know, sometimes the cattails in ponds get so thick that you can't find egg masses within them, but for some reason it's been thin enough, or I noticed they maybe did a little bit of thinning before the last, you know, time that I'd been there to kind of keep that under control. So there's still ample spots in between all of those cattails for the red-legged frogs to find a little bit of sun. So yeah, we'll just kind of be walking through there and be like, red-legged, red-legged, red-legged. So yeah, that's a pretty cool spot. And we're getting into the good ones. This is one of my favorite spots. And I know that some of you were maybe interested in going to find amphibians with your family. And I think that this one would be one of the coolest ones to go to. So we've had lots of red-legged frogs as well as chorus frogs and long-toed salamanders, sometimes 100 plus of those. So in the summer, it dries out. It's just this really tiny pond that they didn't even mean to have it be a pond, but then it just started filling up with water. So they're like, okay, we'll let it be a pond. But it started out kind of like more grassy stuff. And then over time, it's kind of filled in with more vegetation. Like even within this last year, it seems like it's really getting a lot more established as a pond with pond vegetation. But like over on this end, I don't know, it's like a little bit more shady or something. We'll find, you know, the intermittent, you know, like chorus frog, and long-toed salamander through this end, but then all the red-legged frogs like to go on the far end of this pond for whatever reason. So yeah, here's a bunch of Horus frogs, kind of a close-up, you know, of some of these guys. More red-leggeds. So you can kind of see some of the difference in like color between some of these Horus frogs, between like the red and the brown. So that's why color isn't always, you know, our indicator for those. We go by multiple traits. But here's just how frequent those red-legged frog egg masses were at the end of the pond. And they're just kind of in there with that grassy vegetation, kind of fixed to something, you know, so they're not moving around. But there's definitely a lot of them. And then another really cool site nearby is these Fairgrounds Ponds. And they, I guess in the winter, this whole area, prairie area, gets covered in water. So the two ponds become one. But, you know, by the time I go there, you know, early spring and stuff, they've come down to ponds. So in the summer, you know, the vegetation gets a lot higher and it's harder to see the water. But once you get down into it, you can see it's a nice deep pond. But in the spring, you can see it a lot easier from further away because all that vegetation on the side has died down. So you can see there's two large sized ponds. Oops. And when I was doing the summer surveys here, you know, a lot of the sites I would spend, you know, a really long time trying to net these tadpoles, but at this site, I would just, you know, find sometimes like 5 or 6 like in one net full, you know, because they were just like so plentiful. So for whatever reason, I haven't found any bullfrogs up there, and it's great habitat because it's got this nice foresty woodland nearby, so they don't have to cross any roads or, you know, they've got a lot of good traveling area, you know, hiding spaces from predators and all of that, you know, along their path. So this is really, really prime habitat for them. And since it gets deep enough in the middle, you know, it's able to have the open spaces. So along the fringe is usually where we find most of the egg masses. Although I thought it was interesting this year, I was finding a number of Northwest salamander egg masses kind of along the fringe, just like underneath like a little bit of like vegetation on the side, just kind of nestled in. So I don't know. It really plentiful, sometimes over 100 egg masses, and then just kind of one after another. So here's some videos of inside the pond. So there's some chorus frog at the beginning. And then these are kind of hard to see. Those shadows are the Northwest salamander. They're really firm jelly. You know, try to play that one more time just because, yeah, there's big kind of orange melon sized guys. Just stick into that planty vegetation. They usually like to have like a firm stalk that they go through. And then, oops.
Oh, there's one in the corner. There you go.
Let's see if we can mute that. But yeah, we found a hatching egg mass, which was really cool. So little guys wiggling around in there. And we also found a rough skin newt swimming around. which was super cool. We don't really look for the newt's eggs because they're really hard to find. They only lay one individually, kind of underneath the grass. So I have yet to see one. But yeah, those are some of the sites that you can find amphibians in Clark County. There we go.
Thank you, Michelle. We have a number of really awesome questions that have come in, and then I know some people have also submitted some questions beforehand, so we will get started. The first one, there's a couple of just questions asking about some of the stuff you showed. So somebody asked, where is Silicone Forest in Vancouver?
So it's like off 18th Street, like close to Burnt Bridge Creek area, like Fort Vancouver. It's like actually there's like the Silicone Forest Electronics is like across the street from it is like how we got the name, but it's just like this back ditch like in this industrial area.
Okay. What kind of frogs / tadpoles are at the bridge at the end of the wooded trail at Vancouver Lake? Do you know?
The bridge at the end of the wooded trail at Vancouver Lake. I do not know.
Okay. I mean, do you have any guesses of, I mean, it's around a wooded trail around Vancouver Lake, so.
I mean, yeah, probably tree frogs though.
Yeah, probably some chorus frogs.
It's tree frogs. If they're not making noises, then that's why they get frogs.
I'm gonna just jump around a little bit. Thank you for sharing these great photos. Does SWAMP or any other group conduct other monitoring such as temperature, vegetation, etc., that is used with the surveys? Also, how does the survey data get used?
So we do not collect a lot of like water quality data yet. And I would like to add that, but I don't know, as of yet, I haven't found a good way to get, consistent gear, disseminated to like all of my volunteers. But I'm definitely at least trying to add like a habitat assessment for each site to kind of assess what's going on habitat wise at least. And then we're trying to work with more partners in the area to get people to use the data, but I guess so far there's not like a lot of funding for amphibian projects. Most of it isn't fish.
So if anyone wants their data, they should contact you. And you can probably also use the volunteers to help collect additional data too, right? Like maybe
definitely. I'm always looking for more volunteers, and we are currently conducting surveys. So, if you want to get involved, I can train you in the field and, schedule an outing with, like a COVID safe outing, with just you or people that are within your household or bubble,
I was just thinking we have a lot, based on the surveys, it does seem like there's a number of people that are with different agencies here too. So maybe if one of them could use the data, they could reach out and work with you on that.
Definitely. Cool. Yeah, I would like to see it used more for like some of the restoration in the county to kind of make a lot of these sites more functional for the amphibians.
Awesome. Somebody asked, are you saying coarse frog or chorus frog?
Chorus, yeah.
Like
singing in a chorus.
Yeah. Okay.
So they have multiple names or common names, both the Pacific tree frog and the chorus frog. So you can call them either one.
Do you have any observations on differences of reed canary grass infested wetlands versus more native vegetative wetlands on amphibian diversity and or population?
They will still use areas that have reed canary grass. I guess it's more a matter of like, how thick it gets and how much it takes over, like if you cut it back, like I think it's that reed canary grass at the ditch at Heritage Farm, but when they cut it back, the amphibians were still able to use the pond around it. But if they just let it keep growing, it would kind of suffocate the area for the amphibians to use.
Okay. It seems kind of along those same lines-ish. It seems like a lot of these systems are highly disturbed or modified systems. Do you collect any cover or vegetation density data, which you already said you don't really collect a lot of that stuff? So, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit more about like how many of these systems are like disturbed, modified, and that kind of stuff.
So I did collect that data when I was doing my research project in like 2017. And I did find that it seems like the amount of plant cover and the surrounding vegetation were big highly influential, for their site selection. So that's kind of what I want to do, like with the habitat assessment part of it.
Yeah. And I know that there's a lot of people in the regions that kind of have a standardized habitat assessment form.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I wanted to pair up with, like some of the people that have been doing it already and trying to standardize a way to do it.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a couple of other things. So, okay, so you were showing Lucia Falls, and you were talking about how you were kind of seeing them in some areas versus not. Do you think that there was any like substrate difference or like anything with the bedrock around there and like the differences in where you were finding amphibians versus not?
Yeah, what I noticed is the ones that were like really shaded were not having amphibians. They like to have the open sun, and the ones that didn't have any vegetation present, then they didn't have like anything to attach to really. So they wouldn't use those as much, or they'd also kind of select the sites in the pond, where the vegetation was. So it was kind of like every available piece of vegetation, in some spots had some.
Was there any difference with like the substrate and like how much like sediment and stuff was at the bottom of some of these areas versus like, I just imagine there's a lot of scouring out of the rock and stuff around there. Do you notice anything with that? If not, it's okay.
Like I have noticed, I don't know, like if there's, I guess a lot of like leaf litter or something, sometimes it'll like choke out the plant life. And it seems like that's not as good. But I've also at Lucia Falls, there was one time I went there and there was this one pond that just had, like some leaf litter or like substrate on the bottom, and there were a bunch of like chorus frogs just like attached to the top of the leaves. So, they're just like using whatever's available, but like in the sunny spot. So I think the sun and available vegetation, are the biggest factors for them.
Are there currently, I think you kind of already talked about this, but are there currently any invasive species in Clark County for which we should be on the lookout, and where are you finding them?
So that's like bullfrogs. They were brought over from the East Coast for their food, to be eaten as food, because they're big juicy legs, but they are much larger than our native amphibians and can eat the adult frogs. So they're probably the reason that the Oregon spotted frog is locally extirpated, and a lot of spots in Washington, that and like habitat degradation. But I did hear about this one spot in Washington, because like the Oregon spotted frogs kind of have this like technique where, like if they're being hunted, they'll just like try to sit still and like hide, and like not be seen or whatever. And then the bullfrogs will see them, and they're bigger, so they can like hop faster and like overtake the Oregon spotted frogs. But there was one spot in the area where they kind of adapted, and they learned to like start moving away from the bullfrogs faster, so they weren't getting eaten by the bullfrogs there.
Yeah, that was a study by, I think, Kyle at PSU, right? Kyle, is that his name? I can't remember. Yeah. Okay, where do the amphibians go when some of these little ponds dry up? Can they travel very far without water access?
Yes, they actually overwinter in the forest. So they spend most of their lives outside of the water, and just find kind of moist and dark, spots, so that they're not over drying.
Yeah, and I had a question that I answered. I typed the answer, but somebody was asking about kind of dimensions and feet and whatever. And I referenced a study that I did with the city of Gresham, where we actually found that they needed about a 200-meter buffer around a site for like optimal usage of that pond. So it's really important to have that overwintering site.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. But the bullfrogs prefer those larger ponds because it takes them more than a year usually to metamorphose. So there's a lot more competition in those permanent ponds versus the temporary ones.
Yeah, and I think that there's quite a bit of chattage in the Q&A and stuff, that just the importance of collecting that habitat data so that people can use it. So I think people are really interested. So definitely reach out to Michelle if you'd like to collaborate with getting that data. I know that she's been asking around for how people might be able to use it, and move it a little beyond the community science level to maybe how y'all could use it. So if you have a site that that Michelle is surveying or could survey with volunteers and the habitat, I think you'd probably work with them, right?
Definitely.
I just kind of, I pushed into that corner. Okay, so I think we have enough time for another question. It looks like most of them in here are we've answered, but let me see if there's a question when you guys all submitted earlier that maybe. I think you did a great job of just showing examples tonight of the sites in Clark County, but if somebody has maybe some of this habitat in their backyard, are there any things that they should think about with that habitat, and maybe any plants that should or should not be used, or other habitat features that they should do to encourage amphibians on their property or near their house?
I think probably you actually could give them a little bit better advice about that, since you've been working with landowners about how to restore their ponds. And that's part of why I want to do that, like more habitat assessment, because I want to be able to list off the specific plants that people would need to install. But, you know, obviously get rid of the invasives if you have any invasives around them. And, you know, kind of check out what's going on, I guess, you know, and if it's functioning before or making any major changes.
Yeah, well, I think oftentimes what's a good technique is noticing what you have been seeing out in the wilds of sorts, even though some of these are, you know, a lot of these are modified ponds, but like observing first what is being done and being used. And so seeing what some of those observations are that you are seeing, and then, or in your own backyard, you know, observing that. And obviously if you're seeing things being used to keep that, but then, you know, there could be some things that you could also do. But I guess that's really the crux of my question is, are there some things that you're observing out there during swamp that you're just kind of like, these things seem to be good?
Well, I do see a lot of cattails at sites, and I feel like in moderation, you know, they seem to do really well at sites with cattails. There's also this, it's, let me see, I don't know, is it like the, if you remember, like the WSU pond, like the barn pond, it's that kind of like leafy. Let me see if I can scroll back, like really.
Well, that right there is duckweed.
Yeah, yeah, let me see if I can.
I mean, I will say while you're looking that up, for me, things that I often tell people to consider is making sure to have a good buffer zone around your pond or amphibian, having things like rock piles, wood piles, lots of good vegetation that amphibians can hide from predators, both in and out of the water. So in the upland areas, your adults are going to be, you know, utilizing the uplands for most of the year. And so that's a really good place to make sure that they are able to burrow in and keep safe, and having that really adjacent, as well as Michelle has shown a lot, that having some vegetation in the water is really important, and sticks and stuff like that. Like sometimes I've just like thrown sticks into ponds when I go by, because they'll be able to attach their egg masses to those. So you just kind of want to think about like the normal, like food, water, shelter, you know, staying away from predators, and make sure to optimize those things. The other thing that is really important for different species is how long the water is in the pond. And that's where some of our native amphibians are able to outcompete like the bullfrogs, because bullfrogs oftentimes they actually spend sometimes like 2 years. There's some evidence that they're actually metamorphing faster, but a lot of them take 2 years to metamorph. So if the ponds dry out, that's one way that our native amphibians are able to outcompete them, because they can live in those ponds that dry out.
So this is it. This kind of.
Oh yeah, I'm really bad with my wetland plants. You put me on the spot.
Yeah, but I've noticed in some sites that the salamanders, the Northwest salamanders, really like this. If it's a deep enough site. And I think somebody mentioned in the comments, you know, about like getting rid of like the permanent ponds. And I really don't think that's the answer, because the red-legged frogs and the Northwest salamanders also really like those permanent ponds. So, you know, you can't really get rid of one without the other.
Okay, well, thank you guys, everyone. We have spent a whole hour here tonight, so thank you so much for joining us. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to Michelle and ask those. You can also reach out to me. I do site visits in Clark County for people, and so if you are interested in having me out, I am also available. But hopefully, Michelle, somebody on here can use some of this data, and you guys can continue doing the really great work up here in Clark County. So thank you guys all for joining us tonight. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you.